Human beings sometimes choose what they know will hurt them. They refuse sensible advice, damage a friendship, spoil a success, or defend an action that has already made them ashamed. These choices are not always mistakes made in ignorance. At times, a person sees the better road and turns away from it because being predictable feels like a kind of imprisonment. Freedom then appears in its darkest form. The power to say no, even to happiness, reason, conscience, and love. Fyodor Dostoevsky made that disturbing possibility the center of a lifetime's work. His novels ask why a creature capable of tenderness can become deliberately cruel, and why the same creature may later confess, accept responsibility, or begin again. He gives no tidy formula. Arguments arrive through proud students, frightened prisoners, skeptical brothers, holy fools, political conspirators, injured women, and compromised believers. Each voice tests the others, and no voice leaves the contest unchanged. The question matters because every social order depends upon some picture of human motivation. If people reliably pursue their interests, institutions can guide them through incentives and knowledge. If people also desire independence, recognition, revenge, belonging, and moral meaning, calculation alone will fail. Yet the defense of freedom creates another danger. It can excuse vanity, domination, and avoidable pain. Dostoevsky's world holds both truths together. We will follow that world from a prison yard to an underground room, from a theory of exceptional people to the silence of Christ before the Grand Inquisitor. We will also face the objections that suffering is too easily spiritualized, that his religious answer remains uncertain, and that his own nationalism and prejudice limit his moral vision. The aim is not to turn a novelist into a system. It is to listen as his competing voices ask why freedom makes cruelty possible, and how, without ceasing to be free, a person might return. Part 1. The Sentence and the Open Sky. On a cold day in December of 1849, Dostoevsky stood with other condemned prisoners in St. Petersburg's Semyonovsky Square. The men had been arrested for taking part in the Petrushevsky Circle, a loose gathering that discussed literature, social reform, and forbidden political ideas. Dostoevsky had read aloud a banned letter criticizing serfdom and the alliance between church and state. A military court imposed death sentences. The prisoners were dressed for execution, divided into groups, and made to believe that their final minutes had arrived. Only then was the sentence commuted. The reprieve had been planned in advance as part of the punishment. Dostoevsky was sent to 4 years of hard labor in Omsk, followed by compulsory military service in Siberia. The episode should not be converted into a dramatic key that explains every later page. Human lives are not solved by one event, yet the ordeal changed the conditions under which his questions would be asked. Mortality, authority, humiliation, and the value of ordinary time were no longer distant themes. He had been born in Moscow in 1821 and trained at the Military Engineering Academy, though literature drew him away from an engineering career. His first novel, Poor Folk, brought sudden recognition in 1846. The acclaim faded, and his following works met uncertainty or ridicule. Before Siberia, he was already attentive to poverty, wounded pride, double consciousness, and the strange theatre people construct around shame. Prison did not create those concerns, but it stripped them of literary safety. Notes from a Dead House, the semi-fictional account that grew from the penal years, places a noble narrator among convicts whose lives cannot be reduced to the official word criminal. Some are vain, generous, brutal, patient, comic, or unreadable. The narrator learns that the prison contains neither a brotherhood of innocent victims nor a separate species of monsters. it contains persons. They remain morally responsible, yet the institution often degrades more efficiently than it reforms. This distinction is central. To insist on a prisoner's humanity is not to deny the prisoner's offense. Dostoevsky's mature moral psychology repeatedly refuses the easy choice between condemnation and excuse. A deed can be terrible, its causes can be intelligible, and its author can remain more than that deed. Responsibility requires precisely this excess. If a person were only the mechanical result of environment, there would be no one to answer. If a person were only an isolated will, there would be no context to understand. The prison sharpened Dostoevsky's awareness of freedom through its absence. Convicts treasured small permissions, private money, a holiday performance, a moment beyond supervision. Their longing did not always produce noble behavior. Sometimes the desire for one uncontrolled hour led to reckless spending or quarrels. Constraint could intensify caprice. A human being deprived of meaningful agency might seize a destructive substitute simply to feel that an action was his own. That observation became larger than prison. Modern projects often promise liberation by arranging life more efficiently. Dostoevsky would ask what happens when the arrangement treats the person as an object to be managed. Good intentions do not prevent domination if the recipient has no voice. Even benevolence can humiliate when it decides in advance what another person must want. The mock execution also left a more intimate question. When time seems almost gone, its value appears immeasurable. But ordinary life soon returns, along with irritation, debt, ambition, and distraction. The person who has seen the open sky as a gift may still wound others beneath it. Knowledge of mortality does not guarantee goodness. Suffering can reveal value, but it can also embitter. This is the first warning we must carry forward. No ordeal redeems by itself. In a letter written soon after the reprieve, Dostoevsky described life as a gift and imagined accounting for every minute. Later years did not follow that aspiration cleanly. He struggled with debt, deadlines, gambling, illness, and loss. These facts should not be used to turn biography into moral judgment. They show something closer to his fiction. Revelation may be sincere while habit remains stubborn. A new understanding still has to become a sequence of ordinary choices. The novels would repeatedly return to an interval between sentence and ending. A condemned person measures minutes. A suspect waits for arrest. A family waits for a verdict. Such intervals strip away the illusion that freedom requires endless options. Sometimes only one or two actions remain, yet their moral meaning grows sharper. Constraint does not eliminate agency all at once. It can reduce its field until a word, refusal, or gesture carries the weight of a life. Part 2. Russia in the Age of Formulas. Dostoevsky returned to European Russia during a period of immense social argument. Serfdom was abolished in 1861, though emancipation did not end poverty or unequal power. New journals, political groups, and literary factions debated how Russia should change. Westernizers looked toward European institutions and science. Slavophile and later soil-oriented thinkers stressed Russian tradition, communal life, and Orthodox Christianity. These labels hide many disagreements, but they indicate the charged setting in which a novel could function as political intervention. One influential tendency joined materialism to rational egoism. In its Russian setting, rational egoism held that human action could be explained through interest, and that enlightened people would see cooperation as serving their real advantage. Nikolai Chernyshevsky's novel What is to be Done offered disciplined, rational characters and images of a reorganized society. The book inspired many young radicals. Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, published in 1864, answered this atmosphere, although its target is broader than any single author. The attraction of rational reconstruction is easy to understand. Hunger, arbitrary privilege, and legal oppression are not cured by celebrating mystery. Better knowledge and institutions can reduce preventable suffering. Dostoevsky sometimes wrote as if his opponents believed human beings were little machines. Many reformers held more nuanced views. Any fair reading must admit that his polemics can caricature materialism and socialism, especially when he blends distinct positions into a single threatening trend. Still, he identified a problem that remains alive. A model may predict behavior statistically while failing to describe what action means to the actor. People respond not only to outcomes, but to the way choices are offered. A benefit imposed can feel different from a benefit chosen. A correct prediction can provoke resistance because the predicted person wants to prove that no formula owns him. The resistance may be foolish, yet the need behind it is not imaginary. Dostoevsky was not defending ignorance against knowledge. His deeper objection concerned reduction. An explanation becomes reductive when it treats one genuine cause as the whole person. Economic pressure matters. So do habit, bodily condition, social imitation, and unconscious impulse. But a moral encounter also includes address. Someone says, "I did this, I hid it, I wanted it, or I want to change." Dostoevsky's novels live in the unstable space between causal explanation and personal answerability. This is why his characters speak so much. They do not merely report beliefs. They try to create themselves before an audience. A confession may conceal. An accusation may beg for love. A theory may defend a wounded ego. Reason remains present, but it becomes dramatic. We learn what an idea does inside a life, how it changes under humiliation, desire, rivalry, and fear. The method has a cost. Extreme situations dominate his fiction. Murders, scandals, breakdowns, inheritances, and spiritual crises. Ordinary moral steadiness can seem faint beside them. Critics may reasonably ask whether people are really so divided, or whether Dostoevsky magnifies rare states until they resemble a universal psychology. The answer is not that every day looks like his novels. It is that crises expose possibilities that quieter routines often keep covered. He also distrusted the notion that a perfected social environment would perfect its inhabitants. This distrust can serve humane skepticism, but it can also become politically conservative. If every reform is dismissed because people remain flawed, injustice gains a convenient shelter. Dostoevsky's best insight is narrower. Institutions matter enormously, but no institution abolishes moral agency. A humane politics must improve conditions without imagining that persons can be completed by administration. The coming chapters will therefore separate two claims. One is sensible. Human motives exceed rational self-interest. The other is dangerous. Whatever defies calculation deserves protection as freedom. The underground man will force that separation. He rebels against the formula, but his rebellion does not free him. It becomes another formula written in resentment. The Crystal Palace, built in London for the Great Exhibition of 1851, became one of the underground man's images for rational modernity. Its glass architecture suggested transparency, engineering, and organized abundance. In Russian debate, it could symbolize a future built by enlightened calculation. His hostility is directed less at a particular building than at the fear of a completed world in which no meaningful objection remains. A palace becomes intolerable when it includes everything except the right to question its design. There is an irony in this protest. Rational egoism tries to align individual benefit with social cooperation, while the underground man proves his independence by making himself miserable. But misery alone cannot show that his account of humanity is deeper. It may show only that damaged pride can defeat judgment. Dostoevsky's achievement is to make the protest logically incomplete and psychologically unforgettable. The opponent of the system becomes evidence both against the system and against himself. Part 3. Freedom Inside the Dead House. Notes from a Dead House begins indirectly. Its narrator, Alexander Petrovich Goryanchikov, is a fictional nobleman sentenced for killing his wife. This device helped Dostoevsky transform personal experience into art and navigate censorship. The book is therefore neither transparent memoir nor ordinary novel. Its sketches move among work details, hospital stays, punishments, celebrations, and portraits of inmates. The fragmented form matters. Prison is known through repeated days and partial encounters, not through a single explanatory plot. The narrator initially finds an immense distance between himself and the other convicts. Class difference survives inside uniform punishment. He is educated, noble, and socially awkward among men who often distrust him. He cannot purchase fellowship with sympathetic intentions. This is one of Dostoevsky's hardest lessons about love. Wanting to feel united with others does not erase the position from which one approaches them. Over time, individual faces emerge from the collective label. The kind and the violent are not arranged into clean groups. A person capable of tenderness may also have committed grave harm. Another may endure punishment without visible repentance. The narrator's growing perception does not become a theory that crime is secretly beautiful. It becomes a refusal to let legal classification exhaust moral identity. Freedom appears here in humble and distorted forms. A convict saves coins, finds tobacco, chooses how to spend a holiday, or participates in a theatrical performance. Such acts restore a thin margin of authorship. Yet the same hunger for self-direction can erupt as waste, intoxication, or aggression. When legitimate agency is almost absent, caprice can feel like sovereignty. The person says, in effect, at least this ruin is mine. The point is not that repression causes every offense. Dostoevsky does not offer a modern social scientific study, and he often judges his subjects through the assumptions of his century. But he sees that punishment changes the motives it claims to correct. Forced labor may train concealment or hostility rather than responsibility. Humiliation may make confession harder because the institution has already defined the prisoner as beneath dialogue. This complicates the meaning of suffering. Pain can interrupt self-deception, but it can just as readily narrow attention to survival. It can invite solidarity or produce rivalry over scarce relief. Later characters will discover meaning during suffering, yet that sequence must not be reversed. The meaning does not prove that the suffering was necessary, deserved, or beneficial. Redemption, where it occurs, comes through a person's response and relationships, not through pain acting as a cleansing substance. The dead house also changes the observer. Goryanchikov must learn to see without sentimental possession. He cannot make the prisoners into examples for his own moral improvement. Their unreadable parts remain. This reserve anticipates Dostoevsky's later art, where another consciousness cannot be fully captured from outside. A person may surprise the narrator, the authorities, and himself. The convict's theatrical performance gives this principle a communal form. Men ordinarily watched by guards become actors, musicians, craftsmen, and an audience for one another. The event does not abolish the prison or prove that art heals every wound. It temporarily rearranges roles. Those classified by the institution create a shared world with timing, humor, and mutual attention. Freedom appears not as escape from all limits, but as coordinated activity that no official schedule fully explains. The hospital sections offer a different contrast. Illness may loosen labor requirements, yet the patient remains under rules and exposed to punishment's aftermath. Care exists inside the coercive institution without redeeming it. Dostoevsky notices attendance, fellow patients, and small mercies, but he does not let kindness turn the prison into a good place. This distinction will matter later when individual love is asked to answer harms produced by social structures. That surprise is morally double. It makes generosity possible because no one is finalized as the worst thing done. It also makes danger possible because prediction remains incomplete. Dostoevsky will build much of his philosophy around this open remainder. A society that denies it becomes mechanical. A conscience that worships it becomes lawless. The prison gate eventually opens, but freedom outside is not pure release. Habits of fear, pride, and estrangement travel with the former prisoner. Dostoevsky himself returned to writing with changed religious and political convictions, though they were never simple. He valued Orthodox faith more intensely, distrusted revolutionary abstractions, and idealized aspects of the Russian people. Experience deepened his vision, but it did not make every later judgment wise. The sequence from sentence to Siberia also helps explain why authority appears in his work as both necessary and morally perilous. The state that punished him claimed a right to preserve order, and the Petrushevsky circle was not uniform in aim or method. Yet the staged reprieve turned human terror into a demonstration of sovereign power. Later, Dostoevsky would support forms of authority that many readers find troubling. His fiction nevertheless remembers how easily correction becomes theatre when the ruler faces no answer from the ruled. His return was not a straight line from youthful socialism to settled conservatism. He retained concern for poverty and communal obligation while rejecting the secular, revolutionary paths proposed by former allies. Orthodox Christianity became central, but doubt remained active enough to generate Ivan's rebellion. This mixture prevents biography from serving as a conversion diagram. The ideas changed through experience, argument, grief, and political reaction. They never became a single calm doctrine behind the novels. The Dead House leaves us with a measured proposition. Freedom is not first the ability to obtain whatever one wants. It is the space in which a person can answer, initiate, withhold, and relate. Remove that space and dignity withers. Treat every use of that space as sacred, and cruelty gains a shield. Notes from Underground begins exactly at this difficult boundary. Part 4. The Underground Man Says No. The unnamed speaker of Notes from Underground is a retired civil servant living in St. Petersburg. He is educated, isolated, spiteful, and painfully aware of his own performance. He insults his imagined readers, withdraws the insult, anticipates their reply, and accuses them of thoughts they have not expressed. The underground is a room, a social position, and a style of consciousness. It is where reflection has lost contact with action but continues talking. His famous revolt concerns a future organized by reason. Suppose science could explain every motive and demonstrate a person's true advantage. Suppose social life could be arranged so efficiently that destructive choices became irrational remnants. The underground man predicts that someone would still choose against advantage, perhaps at terrible cost, simply to preserve the experience of independent wanting. He fears becoming a piano key played by natural laws and administrative experts. There is a serious insight inside the provocation. People value authorship as well as welfare. We care whether a decision is ours, whether persuasion respects us, and whether improvement leaves room for dissent. A world that delivers comfort while treating inhabitants as manipulable objects would be missing a human good. The Grand Inquisitor will later offer exactly such a bargain: security in exchange for the burden of freedom. But the underground man does not establish a satisfying alternative. His freedom is almost entirely negative. He proves independence by refusing, delaying, and injuring. If reason says 2 times 2 is 4, he dreams of asserting something else, not because the alternative is true, but because truth feels like a wall. This is less an account of free agency than a picture of agency starving for a positive purpose. He also confuses unpredictability with freedom. A random act can surprise observers without expressing a coherent self. Addiction, compulsion, and panic may be unpredictable in practice while narrowing agency. To act freely cannot mean only that no one guessed correctly. It must include some capacity to recognize reasons, sustain commitments, and answer for consequences. Dostoevsky lets the underground man's failure reveal this missing dimension. The novella's first half is argumentative, but the second half returns to humiliating events from the speaker's youth. This shift is essential. His philosophy is not tested in a lecture hall. It is tested in a dinner with former schoolmates, an absurd fixation on an officer who once moved him aside, and his encounter with Liza, a young woman in a brothel. The scenes show an injured pride converting vulnerability into domination. The officer hardly notices him, yet the underground man nurses the slight for years. He plans an encounter on the pavement in which neither will yield. The eventual collision means almost nothing to the officer, but it becomes a private triumph for the speaker. Recognition has been reduced to physical symmetry. Because he cannot secure mutual regard, he settles for obstructing another body. This is the first clear path from freedom to deliberate cruelty. The underground man feels unseen. He cannot ask directly for respect without risking rejection. So he constructs a scene in which he controls the terms. Cruelty promises a brief escape from dependence because the victim's reaction proves his power. Yet the proof requires the very other person he pretends not to need. His argument against rational egoism therefore turns inward. He demonstrates that people may act against happiness, but he also shows why celebrating that fact is disastrous. The power to reject advantage protects individuality from management. It can also trap individuality in permanent opposition. A self built only from no eventually has nothing of its own to affirm. The underground man is not Dostoevsky speaking without disguise. The author frames him as a recognizable product of his social world, then allows him enough intelligence to wound every easy theory. We should neither dismiss him as merely ill nor enthrone him as a prophet. He is an experiment. What becomes of freedom when it has lost trust, shared action, and the hope of being loved without conquest? His excessive consciousness provides another warning. He analyzes motives until every possible action appears compromised. A generous deed might conceal vanity. A protest might conceal envy. Because no motive is pure, he concludes that action is fraudulent. This looks like moral rigor, but it protects him from correction. A deed performed among others can be answered and revised. A deed endlessly examined in advance remains perfect only because it never enters the world. The stone wall of necessity also irritates him. Facts, natural laws, and consequences appear as insults to desire. Yet mature agency needs resistance from reality. A promise matters because time and other people limit what can be done. Freedom without a world to answer would be indistinguishable from fantasy. The underground man's rage at the wall reveals that he wants authorship without dependence, a self whose wishes never meet an equal fact. The underground man's rebellion becomes more disturbing when we recognize that he is not defending one clear value against a mistaken theory. He defends the power to contradict himself. If a rational planner could calculate every interest and arrange society accordingly, he imagines that a person might deliberately choose what is harmful simply to prove that choice has not been absorbed into the table. Freedom appears as the ability to ruin the prediction. This is not a stable philosophy of liberty. A freedom that exists only through negation remains dependent on what it rejects. The underground man needs the rational system in order to experience himself as its exception. He cannot build a life from the refusal because any positive commitment would expose him to standards, consequences, and other people. His independence is therefore a form of captivity. The famous preference for 2 times 2 making 5 should not be read as an argument against arithmetic. It dramatizes resentment toward a model of humanity that treats consciousness as a mechanism of enlightened interest. Human beings desire recognition, symbolic victory, revenge, sacrifice, and the right to interpret their own suffering. A social theory that excludes these motives will not make them disappear. They return in distorted forms. Yet Dostoevsky does not prove that irrationality is sacred. The underground man's spite damages himself and others. He humiliates Liza after inviting her trust because her compassion threatens the hierarchy he has created in imagination. His theoretical defense of unpredictable will becomes an ordinary act of cruelty. This passage prevents the reader from romanticizing rebellion. Freedom without the capacity to receive another person can become only domination on a smaller stage. His excessive self-consciousness also fails to produce self-knowledge. He can analyze motives from several angles, anticipate objections, and mock his own vanity. The analysis does not free him because it is used defensively. Every possible criticism is spoken in advance, so no listener can surprise him. Self-awareness becomes armor. He would rather accuse himself theatrically than allow another person to name a specific harm. The underground condition is social as well as psychological. Bureaucratic rank, literary fashion, ideals of masculine honor, and the imported language of rational egoism shape his humiliations. He is not a timeless, isolated mind. St. Petersburg supplies offices, streets, cramped rooms, and status distinctions in which resentment acquires form. Historical context does not excuse his conduct, but it prevents the text from becoming a generic celebration of irrational man. The continuing relevance lies in the gap between being explainable and being exhausted by an explanation. Psychology, economics, and social science can reveal strong patterns without reducing persons to puppets. The underground man correctly detects the insult of a theory that speaks as if no remainder exists. He responds incorrectly by making the remainder into spite. Dostoevsky leaves us with the harder task of imagining freedom as responsive participation rather than mechanical interest or arbitrary refusal. Part 5. Cruelty as a failed conversation. The encounter with Liza answers that question quietly and painfully. After the disastrous dinner, the underground man arrives at the brothel already humiliated. He speaks to Liza about the future awaiting her, describing loneliness, illness, and abandonment. Some of what he says expresses genuine perception. Much of it is designed to gain emotional power. He discovers another person's vulnerability and enters it as if it were an unlocked room. Liza responds not with the predictable gratitude of a rescued figure, but with feeling and attention. The underground man gives her his address. For a moment he imagines himself as a benefactor. Then he is horrified that she may come. Her visit would make his elevated speech answerable to ordinary reality. She would see his shabby home, his dependence on his servant, and the gap between performance and character. When Liza arrives, that exposure occurs. The speaker first collapses into self-revelation. He admits that he had been taking revenge for the dinner and using her as an object. This confession might begin a truthful relation. Instead, her compassion becomes unbearable. She embraces him not as a superior, but as another suffering person. The equality he claimed to desire feels like defeat because he is the one receiving mercy. He regains control through humiliation. The exact sequence is morally important. Cruelty does not appear because he lacks insight. He understands much of what he is doing. Nor is he simply overcome by an alien impulse. He chooses the familiar hierarchy rather than remain vulnerable in reciprocity. His freedom is real enough to implicate him, though his habits and wounds constrain what he can imagine. Liza leaves money behind, refusing the role he assigned her. The gesture breaks his script. He runs after her, but not with a stable readiness to repair the harm. Even his remorse is tangled with fantasy. The story ends without reconciliation. This unfinished ending prevents suffering from becoming a convenient moral staircase. Insight has occurred, pain has occurred, and redemption has not. Modern readers may object that Liza receives less interior freedom than the underground man. She is partly used by the novella as a moral test for him, a pattern that recurs in debates about Dostoevsky's women. Her final action resists his control, but the narrative remains centered on his consciousness. Recognizing this limit does not erase the scene's power. It reminds us to ask whose inner conflict becomes philosophy and whose pain becomes evidence. The scene also refines the meaning of confession. Saying the worst truth about oneself can look courageous while functioning as another form of control. If I denounce myself before anyone else can, I manage the verdict. Genuine confession must leave the response to another person. It risks forgiveness, judgment, disbelief, and the demand for repair. The underground man wants exposure without surrendering authorship of the encounter. His servant Apollon provides a quieter version of the same contest. The underground man hates Apollon's composure and imagines contempt in his manner. Because he depends on the servant, payment of wages becomes a ritual of dominance and delay. Material power belongs to the employer, but emotional control does not. Their standoff shows how hierarchy enters domestic details. A person who feels powerless in one room may manufacture dependence in another. Deliberate cruelty often borrows this structure. It seeks not only pain, but a visible confirmation that the agent has altered another person's inner state. The reaction becomes evidence of existence. This helps explain why remorse can coexist with repetition. Once the victim recovers or leaves, the fragile proof disappears. The cruel person may seek it again unless a different form of recognition becomes possible. Here, Dostoevsky locates cruelty inside failed dialogue. The cruel person reduces another consciousness to a predictable part: admirer, debtor, witness, enemy, or victim. The other person's freedom becomes threatening because it may revise the story. Violence, humiliation, and manipulation close that openness. They force an answer whose meaning seems controlled. Yet control remains incomplete. Liza's gesture survives outside the underground man's interpretation. He can brood over it, but he cannot make it signify what he wishes. The other's freedom returns as moral residue. This is why cruelty never fully succeeds in Dostoevsky. It may destroy lives, but it cannot turn a person into a thing without remainder. Redemption would require more than feeling bad. It would require the underground man to endure equality, accept an unplanned response, and act differently over time. Notes from Underground offers no evidence that he can. The next great novel asks whether guilt can force open the room that resentment keeps sealed. Part 6. The Crime of an Idea. Crime and Punishment begins with Rodion Raskolnikov leaving a tiny rented room and walking through the heat of St. Petersburg. He is poor, hungry, proud, and estranged from ordinary routines. He has developed an idea that divides humanity into ordinary people who preserve the world and extraordinary people who may cross moral limits for a higher purpose. He studies historical figures whose violence is excused by later achievement. Then he turns the theory into a test of himself. The murder of the pawnbroker is entangled with several motives. Raskolnikov tells himself that her money could support worthy lives. He resents his family's sacrifices. He longs to escape powerlessness. He also wants to know whether he belongs among those who dare. The theory does not cause the deed like a lever moving a stone. It organizes pride, compassion, shame, and ambition into a permission. The name Raskolnikov evokes division, and division shapes both plot and personality. He oscillates between approaching others and cutting them off, between impulsive generosity and contemptuous withdrawal. These movements do not reveal two separate beings. They reveal a self unable to integrate dependence with dignity. He wants to help without needing help, love without becoming vulnerable, and transform the world without negotiating with those who inhabit it. His dream of a beaten horse appears before the crime and exposes compassion his theory cannot erase. The child within the dream runs toward the suffering animal while the adult plan moves toward murder. We should not treat the dream as a coded diagnosis. It dramatizes moral knowledge that remains active beneath conscious permission. Raskolnikov does not lack access to pity. He tries to overrule it in order to become the person his idea admires. This complexity is one reason Dostoevsky's moral psychology remains compelling. A person can act from several motives that conflict. Raskolnikov sometimes helps strangers with the little money he has. His compassion is not fake. Neither is his contempt. The novel refuses the comforting belief that a generous impulse prevents cruelty. It may coexist with cruelty or even be recruited into its justification. His idea turns persons into categories. The victim becomes a harmful old woman whose removal can be entered into a moral calculation. Raskolnikov imagines benefits distributed after one obstacle is crossed. But actual violence exceeds the concept. The pawnbroker's sister, Lizaveta, appears unexpectedly and is killed as well. A theory designed around controlled transgression encounters another free life and destroys it to preserve itself. The crime therefore exposes a contradiction. Raskolnikov claims exceptional freedom for himself while denying ordinary inviolability to others. His independence depends upon making their existence conditional on his project. Freedom detached from equal personhood becomes privilege. It is no longer the shared capacity to answer and begin. It is permission granted by the self to the self. Afterward, punishment begins before the court intervenes. Raskolnikov falls into fever, suspicion, isolation, and compulsive returns to the subject of the crime. We need not diagnose him from a novel. Dostoevsky is not providing a clinical case report. He dramatizes the fracture between the self who formed the plan and the self who must live after it. Guilt in this novel is more than fear of detection. Raskolnikov often remains proud of the theory and condemns his own failure of nerve. Yet his body, speech, and relationships reveal knowledge he will not fully avow. He is drawn toward confession and away from it. He seeks out the investigating magistrate Porphyry, almost inviting recognition while defending his separateness. Porphyry understands that proof alone is not the whole task. He wants Raskolnikov to confess, though his methods include psychological pressure that modern readers may find manipulative. Sonia offers a different form of address. She does not solve the crime. She receives the criminal's speech without reducing him either to a monster or to a misunderstood genius. The novel's Christian symbolism is clear, but its development is gradual and incomplete. Sonia gives Raskolnikov a cross and accompanies him toward Siberia. This does not mean that love cancels the victims or that legal punishment produces renewal. The epilogue describes only the beginning of a possible change. Redemption remains future tense. Porphyry's conversations add an important complication to determinism. He studies patterns, contradictions, and temperament, almost constructing a psychological net around the suspect. Yet he also speaks as if Raskolnikov must walk into truth himself. Detection and confession are not identical. The investigator can narrow the external options, but the inner meaning of surrender depends on whether the accused recognizes another moral world beyond strategy. Raskolnikov's apocalyptic dream in Siberia imagines people infected by certainty, each convinced that he alone possesses truth. Social cooperation collapses because no common standard survives. The image links private exceptionalism to political disorder. When every self claims exemption and infallibility, freedom does not become plural. It becomes a war of sealed perspectives. The dream prepares the path toward demons, where certainty acquires organization. Crime and punishment thus answers the underground man with consequence. A person can defy rational advantage and moral law. That power proves neither greatness nor liberty. Raskolnikov's transgression narrows his world until nearly every encounter is measured by concealment. The will that tried to stand above relation becomes dependent on a truth it cannot say alone. Raskolnikov's theory divides humanity into ordinary people who must obey and extraordinary people who may transgress for a higher purpose. The theory flatters him before it guides him. It converts poverty, humiliation, ambition, and isolation into evidence that he stands before a test of rank. Murder becomes an experiment in identity. He does not merely ask whether the pawnbroker's death could benefit others. He asks whether he is the kind of man who can step across. This mixture of argument and self-creation explains why a simple refutation does not reach him. If someone proves that the calculation is wrong, the challenge to his imagined exceptional status remains. He may reinterpret failure as weakness rather than reject the hierarchy. Ideas become dangerous when they organize emotional needs that their explicit reasoning does not disclose. The proposition about great men carries a longing to escape powerlessness and shame. The utilitarian surface of the crime is deliberately unstable. Money taken from the pawnbroker is not efficiently used for a public good. Lizaveta's unexpected arrival exposes the fiction of controlled violence. One authorized killing produces another for which the original theory had prepared no justification. Dostoevsky shows how reality enters an abstract plan through another person's body. The victim is never only the category under which the planner placed her. Raskolnikov's physical and psychological disintegration after the crime is not a straightforward divine punishment or a modern clinical case study. Fever, fear, guilt, pride, and the pressure of investigation overlap. He wants to confess and to triumph over the need for confession. He seeks contact and pushes it away. This divided movement makes the novel more than a moral fable in which conscience automatically defeats theory. Porphyry's investigation works partly by recognizing that the criminal is attached to his idea. Evidence matters, but so does the suspect's need to perform intellectual superiority. Conversation becomes a space where theory reveals character. Porphyry can be manipulative, and his psychological method should not be idealized as a model of due process. Still, he understands that Raskolnikov's crime was not only an event to conceal, it was a claim about who Raskolnikov believed himself to be. Sonia provides another measure. Her suffering does not make her simple or passive. She sees Raskolnikov without accepting the hierarchy that sustains him. Her response joins compassion to the demand that he acknowledge the earth and the people from whom the theory separated him. Confession is meaningful only if it ends the privilege of standing outside shared responsibility. The novel remains relevant wherever abstraction turns persons into acceptable costs. Political, economic, and technological decisions inevitably use categories, but categories become morally dangerous when decision-makers imagine that a noble end cancels the reality of those who bear the means. Dostoevsky does not offer a policy for every tragic choice. He insists that no calculation should make the chooser metaphysically extraordinary. The crime of an idea is therefore not that ideas cause action by themselves. It is that an idea can lend grandeur to motives a person does not want to examine. Critical thought must ask both whether the reasoning is sound and what psychic work the reasoning performs. Raskolnikov's error lives in both places. Part 7. Guilt, Confession, and the Common Earth. Raskolnikov's guilt is not a simple inner alarm that rings after wrongdoing. At first, he interprets his distress as evidence that he was not strong enough. He remains more troubled by being ordinary than by having claimed 2 lives. This distinction prevents the novel from offering a sentimental picture of conscience. A person may suffer intensely while still misunderstanding what the suffering means. Shame asks what the deed reveals about me. Guilt, in a narrower moral sense, asks what I have done to another person. The two often mix. Raskolnikov's shame is grandiose because it remains centered on his failed identity as an extraordinary man. Confession begins to change when attention moves outward, toward the dead, toward Sonia, and toward a human world he has treated as material. Sonia tells him to go to a crossroads, bow to the earth, and acknowledge his crime before everyone. The scene is religious, public, and physical. He must descend from the private tribunal in which he was both legislator and accused. The earth represents a reality shared with people who never consented to his theory. His confession to the police will also accept legal consequences, but the moral action is larger than submitting to procedure. We should resist making Sonia into a painless symbol. She lives under economic coercion and bears responsibilities imposed by her family's desperation. The novel gives her spiritual strength, yet sometimes risks idealizing female self-sacrifice. Her loyalty does not make exploitation good. Nor does her suffering earn Raskolnikov's renewal as if one person's pain could purchase another's moral future. What Sonia offers is presence without flattery. She rejects the deed and refuses the theory, but she does not abandon the speaker. This combination is rare in Dostoevsky's world. Condemnation alone can freeze a person in defensive pride. Acceptance without truth can become collusion. Sonia's love keeps judgment and companionship in the same room. Confession then becomes an exercise of freedom against the earlier exercise of freedom. Raskolnikov chose to cross a boundary. Now he may choose to stop managing every interpretation. The second act does not erase the first. Freedom cannot travel backward and make the victims live. Redemption is therefore never restoration to innocence. It is a changed relation to an irrevocable past. The law has a limited but necessary role. A society must protect people and judge actions through evidence. Yet legal guilt and moral acknowledgement do not coincide perfectly. An innocent person may be convicted, as Dmitry Karamazov later will be. A guilty person may confess for vanity, exhaustion, or strategic advantage. Courts determine public responsibility under rules. Conscience must address meanings that no sentence can fully contain. Dostoevsky's post-Siberian writing is often critical of punishment that relies on inflicted suffering as moral education. The mere fact of pain does not teach respect. Prison may produce reflection, but it can also harden resentment. Raskolnikov's change depends less on the penal institution than on continuing dialogue, memory, and Sonia's care. The distinction matters whenever punishment is defended, as if suffering itself corrected the soul. Even the epilogue preserves uncertainty. Raskolnikov experiences a new feeling for Sonia and glimpses a life not organized by theory. The narrator does not claim that years of patient repair have already occurred. The beginning is small. A book lies near him, but belief is not installed by a symbolic object. What has changed is his readiness to receive a story not written by his pride. This is Dostoevsky's first sustained model of redemption. Truth spoken to another, consequences accepted, and love discovered as a relation between free persons. It is persuasive because it remains incomplete. The idiot will test the same hope from the opposite direction. Instead of asking whether a guilty man can return to love, it asks whether an unusually compassionate man can love without saving others by force. There is also a civic dimension to confession. A crime damages more than the private bond between offender and victim. It alters the community's trust and calls for a public account. Raskolnikov's bow at the crossroads is awkward and initially ambiguous, but its direction is significant. He cannot repair a social wound through private spiritual insight alone. The world before which he claimed exceptional privilege must be acknowledged as a world of equals. At the same time, public confession can become spectacle. Crowds may mock, authorities may exploit, and an offender may perform abasement to recover admiration. Dostoevsky never supplies a reliable ceremony that removes these risks. The moral value depends on what follows: truthful testimony, acceptance of proportionate consequences, attention to those harmed, and conduct sustained after the dramatic moment has passed. Part 8. The Experiment of a Good Man. Prince Lev Myshkin arrives in St. Petersburg at the beginning of The Idiot after treatment in Switzerland for epilepsy. He has little money, uncertain social standing, and a disarming directness. Dostoevsky described his artistic problem as the representation of a positively beautiful person. The challenge was not to invent a man who followed rules flawlessly. It was to place open, forgiving attention inside a society structured by status, money, rivalry, and erotic possession. Myshkin notices people whom others treat as comic, compromised, or shameful. He speaks without many of the protective conventions that make social life manageable. His openness can interrupt humiliation. It also makes him difficult to place. Those around him alternate between trusting him, mocking him, and trying to recruit him into their desires. The prince's epilepsy is woven into the novel's questions of consciousness and vulnerability. Dostoevsky also lived with epilepsy, but Myshkin should not be read as a disguised medical autobiography. Nor should ecstatic moments before a seizure be romanticized as privileged revelation. The illness exposes fragility and altered experience. It does not certify moral wisdom. Myshkin's goodness is often contrasted with Rogojin's possessive passion and the social calculations surrounding Nastasia Filipovna. Yet the prince is not a stable solution placed between obvious errors. His compassion lacks boundaries. He feels responsible for everyone's pain and has difficulty making choices that exclude. Because action always closes some possibilities, his universal sympathy can become paralysis. This problem appears in his relations with Nastasia Philippovna and Aglaya. Nastasia has been exploited and socially marked by an older man's abuse. She alternates between defiance, shame, and the conviction that she is ruined. Aglaya imagines beauty, heroism, and sincerity, but also tests and humiliates. Myshkin perceives pain in both women. He cannot convert that perception into a truthful commitment that respects each one's agency. Compassion can carry a concealed hierarchy. To pity, someone is to see suffering, but it may also cast the other as a person to be rescued. Nastasia sometimes experiences Myshkin's devotion as mercy offered from moral height, even when he intends no superiority. She wants recognition that does not deny damage and does not define her by it. The prince's love cannot reliably provide that balance. The strongest objection to Myshkin is therefore not that goodness is useless. His presence produces real moments of honesty and tenderness. The objection is that goodness without practical judgment may fail those it seeks to serve. A person can be sincere and still make promises that cannot be kept. Refusing to possess another is not enough. Love must also accept limits, make decisions, and hear refusal. Myshkin's response to a public execution, recounted early in the novel, recalls Dostoevsky's own reprieve. He dwells on the condemned person's awareness of vanishing time and imagines that life would be lived differently if returned. The reflection carries compassion, but it also exposes the prince's tendency to inhabit another's experience completely. Empathy approaches a boundary. One may listen closely without claiming to know the whole interior of another life. The prince's social innocence is equally ambiguous. He sometimes tells truths that convention hides, freeing a room from hypocrisy. At other moments, he cannot read the protective purpose of convention or anticipate what disclosure will do. Tact can conceal injustice, but it can also safeguard privacy. Moral candor requires judgment about who bears the cost of speaking. Innocence alone does not provide that judgment. The novel darkens as the social experiment collapses. Myshkin cannot redeem Nastasia through purity. Rogozhin cannot secure her through possession. Nastasia cannot control unbearable shame by staging repeated escapes. The final scene offers no triumphant moral. Compassion remains beside catastrophe, almost wordless and powerless. This ending corrects any easy reading of Dostoevsky as an author who thinks goodness automatically wins. The prince is not rewarded for virtue, and the injured are not healed by proximity to him. The world can damage a good person. A good person can also participate in confusion through indecision and an unexamined need to save. The idiot expands our question. Cruelty is not the only danger created by freedom. We may harm others through noble self-understandings that leave too little room for their separate voices. Redemption cannot be something one person performs upon another. The next chapter stays with Nastasia's refusal and asks what love would have to surrender before it could become mutual. Prince Myshkin enters The Idiot with a form of openness that other characters struggle to classify. He appears naive, perceptive, ill, compassionate, socially awkward, and at moments unexpectedly firm. The title places goodness under suspicion from the beginning. In a world organized by status, erotic rivalry, money, shame, and performance, a person who does not follow the expected game can look either foolish or holy. Dostoevsky does not allow goodness to function as a magical cure. Myshkin understands suffering but cannot reliably change the structures in which suffering repeats. His compassion toward Nastasia Philippovna is mixed with pity, and pity can create its own inequality. To be seen primarily as wounded may imprison a person inside the wound. Nastasia alternately seeks rescue, rejects it, tests others, and reenacts the humiliation through which society has defined her. The triangle involving Myshkin, Nastasia, and Aglaya reveals limits of benevolent intention. Myshkin wants to spare pain, but he cannot make incompatible promises harmless. Avoiding a decisive boundary can distribute injury rather than prevent it. Goodness requires judgment, timing, and the capacity to accept that one choice may disappoint someone. Compassion without form becomes vulnerable to stronger wills and chaotic circumstances. Rogojin represents neither a simple evil opposite nor merely passionate love. His desire seeks possession so completely that the other's independent life becomes intolerable. Myshkin is drawn toward him through pity, fear, recognition, and a strange brotherhood. Their exchanges show intimacy without safety. Understanding another person's torment does not guarantee protection from what that torment may do. The novel's social gatherings intensify this experiment. Rooms fill with competing interpretations of Myshkin. Some exploit him, some confess before him, some treat him as entertainment, and some demand that his goodness validate their self-image. A good person becomes a screen for projection. If he refuses to condemn, others call him weak. If he sees too clearly, they feel exposed. The community consumes goodness as spectacle while resisting the changes it would require. Myshkin's epilepsy and psychological vulnerability must not be turned into signs of supernatural purity. Dostoevsky drew on his own experience, but the novel is not a medical description. Moments of ecstatic clarity before a seizure carry philosophical importance while remaining joined to illness and danger. Suffering may alter perception without becoming a moral credential. The experiment finally refuses an easy conclusion about whether goodness is possible. Myshkin's failure does not prove that compassion is useless. It shows that private innocence cannot by itself overcome trauma, coercion, social cruelty, and conflicting desire. Goodness needs practices, boundaries, communities, and forms of responsibility. A single luminous person cannot bear the entire moral burden of a damaged world. This makes the novel painful rather than merely pessimistic. Readers continue to glimpse possibilities of recognition that are not false simply because they are fragile. Myshkin sees people whom society has reduced to roles. The tragedy lies in the insufficient conditions through which that seeing could become a sustainable common life. Part 9. Love Without Possession. Nastasia Philippovna enters the novel first as an image. Men evaluate her beauty, history, and price before she is fully present. Her guardian and former abuser hopes to arrange a marriage that will settle the embarrassment of her existence. Other men desire, fear, or bargain over her. She answers by turning the social spectacle against itself. Her dramatic gestures expose the market hidden inside respectable manners. Yet performance becomes a prison of its own. If others expect scandal, she can seize power by creating a larger scandal. If they call her fallen, she can inhabit the role so fiercely that they lose control of the accusation. Like the underground man, she chooses the wound before someone else can inflict it. The choice is intelligible, but it narrows the future. Rogojin offers passion as possession. He wants the beloved so completely that her independent motion becomes intolerable. Myshkin offers pitying acceptance. He sees that she is not guilty for the abuse done to her, an insight the surrounding society resists. But Nastasia suspects that gratitude is expected, even if the prince would deny it. Neither man's love creates enough space for her to become unpredictable without punishment. This does not make the two men morally equivalent. Possessive violence and failed compassion are different. Dostoevsky's crowded structure sometimes draws them into symbolic symmetry, but ethical judgment must preserve distinctions. Good intentions matter, though they do not settle consequences. Coercion remains coercion, however passionately it names itself love. The novel asks whether love can survive the freedom of the beloved. Genuine love wants the other's good, yet the other may reject our picture of that good. Love then reaches a boundary. It can advise, wait, protest, or leave. It cannot guarantee the right ending without replacing the beloved's agency with its own. This boundary also protects the lover. Myshkin's near-limitless availability appears generous, but a relation without durable commitments becomes confusing for everyone. Active love, a phrase developed later in the Brothers Karamazov, is not endless emotional absorption. It is patient work among finite people. Patience includes the ability to make and keep a truthful promise. Nastasia's tragedy must not be described as a lesson that trauma makes destruction inevitable. The novel is art, not prognosis. People who endure abuse follow many paths, and no character supplies a diagnosis for living readers. What Dostoevsky reveals is a moral structure. Shame can make kindness feel unbelievable, while controlling the moment of rejection can seem safer than hoping. The social world shares responsibility. Guests enjoy the scandal, families protect reputation, and money converts injury into negotiation. Private cruelty is supported by audiences who treat another person's crisis as entertainment. Dostoevsky is often called a psychologist, but his psychology is rarely private. Rooms, institutions, and observers help produce the self that later appears to act alone. No single character can repair this world. That limitation is part of the novel's honesty. Love may open a possibility, but it cannot compel another to inhabit it. Moral effort can fail without becoming meaningless. Myshkin's recognition of Nastasia's innocence remains true even though it does not rescue her. Freedom, then, must include the power to receive love and the power to refuse it. That is difficult for any moral vision centered on redemption. If redemption is freely accepted, it can be rejected. If it is imposed, it ceases to respect the person it claims to save. Dostoevsky next transfers this tension from intimate relations to political movements that promise salvation on a social scale. The contrast between pity and recognition helps here. Pity notices suffering and may motivate aid. Recognition encounters the sufferer as someone whose interpretation can correct the helper. Myshkin often reaches recognition, but the surrounding plots pull him back toward rescue. A love capable of redemption would have to combine compassion with curiosity about what the other actually asks, including the possibility that no intimate bond is wanted. The society around Nastasia gives her few credible places from which to choose. Options formally available may be morally distorted by money, reputation, and past coercion. This reminds us that freedom has both an inner and an external dimension. Respecting a decision is important, but justice also asks whether the field of decision has been arranged to make dignity costly. Love alone cannot redesign that field, though love can refuse to exploit it. Part 10. Demons of Political Certainty. Demons emerged from the political turbulence of the 1860s and from Dostoevsky's alarm at revolutionary violence. One immediate background was the case of Sergei Nekev, whose clandestine group murdered a member suspected of disloyalty. The novel transforms such material into a broad satire and tragedy about a provincial town, radical cells, liberal vanity, generational resentment, and the seduction of conspiratorial power. It is tempting to call the book a prediction of 20th century totalitarianism. That claim is too simple. Dostoevsky did not foresee later institutions or events in detail. What he dramatized was a recurring political logic. An ideal of universal liberation can be joined to secrecy, dehumanization, and obedience. The contradiction deserves study without turning the novelist into an infallible prophet. Pyotr Verkovensky builds power through suggestion. His actual network is smaller and less coherent than he implies. He tells each participant enough to create fear of a larger organization. Uncertainty becomes a tool of discipline. People obey partly because they imagine that everyone else has already committed. Political power grows from managed perception as much as from formal authority. Pyotr also turns private weaknesses into public leverage. Vanity, guilt, boredom, and the desire to belong are recruited into ideology. The members of the group do not all share one doctrine. Their unity comes from complicity and fear. Once implicated, each has reason to keep the others silent. A murder is used as cement. The novel's politics are inseparable from its moral psychology. An idea does not float above character. It offers a role. The insignificant person becomes an agent of history. The resentful person gains an authorized enemy. The indecisive person receives commands. The cruel person acquires a moral vocabulary. These satisfactions do not prove the idea false, but they help explain why evidence alone may not loosen its hold. Kirillov takes the question of autonomy to a stark extreme. He imagines self-destruction as the act that will prove humanity free from fear and divine authority. The reasoning is his, not a doctrine Dostoevsky asks us to adopt. It reveals how the desire for absolute independence can turn against the agent's own continued existence. If dependence itself is treated as humiliation, being alive becomes an offense because life arrives unchosen and remains vulnerable. Shatov, by contrast, searches for belonging in an exalted idea of the Russian people. His language combines spiritual longing with nationalism, and the combination is unstable. Community can give freedom a history and a home, but it can also define outsiders as spiritually empty. Demons shows both needs without providing a safe border between them. The wish to belong becomes dangerous when a collective identity demands reverence beyond criticism. Shigalyov presents a system that begins with unlimited freedom and arrives at unlimited despotism. The paradox is comic in delivery and chilling in implication. If equality is defined as the elimination of unpredictable difference, then freedom becomes an obstacle. A planner may conclude that most people must be controlled for their eventual happiness. The Grand Inquisitor will reach a similar result through religion rather than revolutionary theory. Stavrogin represents another center of danger. He attracts projections while remaining inwardly detached. Others imagine in him the leader, transgressor, or spiritual force they need. His freedom appears immense because ordinary moral bonds barely hold him. Yet the absence of commitment is not mastery. It is vacancy. He can cross boundaries, but he cannot create a durable reason to live within any. Dostoevsky's critique is powerful when it shows authoritarian means growing inside emancipatory language. It is weaker when it treats radical politics as a spiritual disease while giving insufficient weight to the injustices that made radical change compelling. Serfdom had only recently ended. Censorship and autocracy were real. A politics of order could be violent too, as Dostoevsky's own punishment demonstrated. The novel also contains broad caricatures and ideological attacks that should not be accepted as neutral sociology. Its satire combines penetrating observation with conservative fear. To read it responsibly is to separate its insight into group coercion from any blanket claim that reform or secular thought leads to terror. What survives that criticism is an account of the temptation of certainty. Political freedom is demanding because citizens disagree, outcomes remain uncertain, and no one possesses the whole future. A movement may promise relief by declaring doubt, treason, and obedience virtue. It then protects the idea from the free persons in whose name it speaks. The murder of the dissenting member makes this protection concrete. The group cannot allow an individual to leave because departure would reveal that membership was voluntary and the supposed organization vulnerable. Violence manufactures the necessity that propaganda had claimed. Afterward, shared guilt replaces shared conviction. The act designed to prove unity shows that unity no longer exists. This mechanism helps distinguish commitment from fanaticism. Commitment can survive questions because its object is not identical with the leader's prestige. Fanaticism treats hesitation as contamination. It narrows the language available to members until doubt can be expressed only as betrayal. Dostoevsky's conspirators are theatrical and exaggerated, but the shrinking of vocabulary is recognizable wherever a group makes belonging depend on repeating its description of reality. Demons portrays political extremity through a community already weakened by vanity, generational resentment, social performance, and the desire to belong to something decisive. The revolutionary cell does not enter a healthy world from outside. It organizes existing frustrations and gives them a language of historical necessity. People who felt insignificant can suddenly interpret themselves as agents of an inevitable future. Pyotr Verkovensky understands organization more clearly than doctrine. He uses secrets, rumors, mutual suspicion, and small acts of complicity to bind members together. The group does not need complete ideological agreement. It needs each person to believe that the others are more committed than he is, and that withdrawal will bring exposure. Apparent unanimity is manufactured from private uncertainty. This mechanism remains recognizable across different political contents. A group becomes dangerous when belonging depends on demonstrating increasing purity, when internal criticism is treated as betrayal, and when leaders gain power by controlling what members believe others believe. The individual may perform certainty to avoid isolation. The performance then becomes evidence that pressures the next person to conform. Shadow's murder shows how violence serves organization beyond its stated target. The act is meant to seal the group through shared guilt. Once participants cross a boundary together, each has reason to protect the others and the leader who can expose them. Violence is not only a means toward revolution, it is a technology of membership. The victim's humanity becomes secondary to the internal needs of the cell. Stavrogin's role is more elusive. Others project strength, freedom, aristocratic command, or spiritual possibility onto him. His detachment creates space for their fantasies. He possesses unusual social power while appearing unable or unwilling to give it a coherent purpose. Dostoevsky explores a form of charisma based on vacancy. Followers fill the vacancy with whatever they most need to see. The novel is often read as prophetic, but prophecy can obscure its historical specificity and artistic exaggeration. Dostoevsky was responding to radical movements, the Nechayev affair, debates about westernization, and his own political and religious development. The caricature of revolutionaries can be unfair if treated as a neutral sociology of all reform. The book's power lies less in predicting one regime than in dramatizing structures through which abstraction, humiliation, and organization converge. Conservative authority is not presented as a simple cure. Provincial officials, established families, and respectable intellectuals are vain, confused, and compromised. Stepan Trofimovich's elevated liberal language often avoids practical responsibility. The existing order helped create the emptiness that extremism exploits. A society cannot answer radical certainty merely by congratulating itself. The novel's title gives possession a political form. Ideas seem to move through people, but people also choose, imitate, conceal, and seek advantage. Calling them possessed must not erase agency. Dostoevsky's religious imagery captures the experience of a system gaining momentum beyond any participant's stated intention. Once fear and complicity structure the group, even doubtful members help produce the outcome they privately dread. Political certainty becomes demonic when it removes every external standard. Evidence is judged by usefulness to the cause. Mercy is weakness. Friendship becomes recruitment. The future is allowed to issue unlimited permissions because no living person can question a future that has not arrived. The antidote is not apathy. It is a politics in which ends remain answerable to means. Groups permit truthful dissent, and no theory grants its agents exemption from ordinary moral limits. Dostoevsky's diagnosis is strongest when applied symmetrically. Religious, nationalist, revolutionary, and technocratic projects can all create closed circles of certainty. The content differs, as do power and consequence, but the psychological temptation recurs. To recognize the structure only in one's enemies is already to reproduce part of it. Part 11. When liberation becomes rule. The political mechanism in Demons begins before the conspirators act. Stepan Trofimovich, Pyotr's father, belongs to an older liberal generation. He enjoys the identity of a persecuted thinker, even when his actual risks are limited. His hostess, Varvara Petrovna, supports and controls him. Their long relationship mixes affection, dependency, pride, and mutual performance. The novel traces destructive politics partly to ideas, but also to adults who prefer grand roles over truthful relations. This generational satire can be unfair. Children do not become violent because their parents held salons or admired European thought. Yet Dostoevsky sees how abstract language passes between generations stripped of hesitation. One generation treats rebellion as style, another turns it into discipline. The transition is not logically necessary, but the loss of responsibility can create fertile ground. Pyotr's organization offers belonging without friendship. Members become interchangeable functions. Secrecy prevents genuine conversation because each person speaks toward an imagined center. The structure resembles the cruel encounter on a larger scale. Another consciousness is no longer a partner who may answer unexpectedly. It is a resource, obstacle, or risk to be managed. Authoritarian certainty often presents itself as mercy. It promises to end confusion, conflict, and the burdens of choice. Decisions will be made by those who understand history. Dissenters can then be described as victims of false consciousness, enemies of the people, or patients who resist treatment. Once disagreement is reclassified as defect, coercion becomes care in the ruler's vocabulary. This temptation is not confined to revolutionary groups. Governments, religious institutions, businesses, families, and even intimate partners can use similar logic. The shared pattern is paternalism without accountability. I know your good so completely that your refusal no longer counts as evidence. Dostoevsky's novels do not provide a policy manual, but they sharpen our ear for this sentence wherever it appears. Still, resistance to paternalism cannot mean that every choice must be honored. Societies limit action to protect others, and care sometimes requires intervention. Children, emergencies, and impaired decision-making create difficult cases. The moral question concerns justification, proportion, review, and the restoration of agency. Dostoevsky's dramatic oppositions rarely settle those practical details. His own politics deepen the problem. In later journalism, especially A Writer's Diary, he defended versions of Russian nationalism and Orthodox mission that could become exclusionary. He expressed ugly anti-Semitic prejudices and sweeping judgments about peoples and nations. These are not incidental blemishes to be hidden behind the novels. They show that a writer who exposed ideological possession could also be possessed by collective myths. The contradiction does not erase his insights, but it changes how we receive them. Moral sensitivity in one domain does not confer immunity elsewhere. The author who insists that no person should be reduced to a category sometimes reduced groups to hostile abstractions. His failure demonstrates his own principle more strongly than a flawless life would have done. Conscience remains vulnerable to the stories that flatter identity. A Writer's Diary also contains fiction, literary criticism, reflections on crime, and appeals to human fellowship. Its voices are more directly authorial than those of the novels, yet even here his positions shift with occasion and polemic. We should not force them into simple consistency. The public moralist and the polyphonic novelist sometimes pull in different directions. Demons leaves political redemption uncertain. Stepan's final movement toward humility carries tenderness, but it cannot undo the town's losses. No purified community appears. The novel warns that liberation becomes rule when leaders value the completed design above unfinished persons. The Brothers Karamazov will place the same conflict in a more difficult setting where the promise of order responds to real and innocent suffering. The modern relevance of this warning does not require equating every strong movement with Pyotr's cell. Organizing, solidarity, and disciplined action can protect the powerless. The relevant questions are structural. Can members leave without terror? Can leaders be corrected? Can facts count against the group's narrative? Are means open to moral scrutiny? Or does the promised future excuse whatever preserves momentum? Dostoevsky's answer remains more diagnostic than constructive. He exposes secrecy, instrumental loyalty, and the dream of total control, but offers little account of democratic institutions able to hold conflict without crushing it. That absence matters. Freedom needs procedures as well as virtue. Fair law, accountable power, protected dissent, and material access to participation. A moral psychology of tyranny is valuable, but it cannot replace political design. Part 12. Ivan returns the ticket. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan speaks to his younger brother Alyosha about the suffering of children. He gathers reports of cruelty and refuses any final harmony purchased at such a price. His rebellion is not a casual denial of religion. He distinguishes between rejecting God and rejecting a world order that would reconcile innocent agony after the fact. Even if harmony came, he says in effect, he would return the entrance ticket. This is among Dostoevsky's strongest presentations of doubt. Ivan's protest cannot be answered by saying that suffering builds character. The children in his examples are not choosing an ordeal for growth. Some do not live to interpret what happened. Any theodicy that makes their pain a means to someone else's spiritual development repeats the logic of Raskolnikov's calculation. Alyosha does not produce a philosophical explanation. He names Christ and responds with a kiss, echoing the gesture that will end Ivan's poem about the Grand Inquisitor. the response can feel insufficient. A gesture of love does not explain why a world containing extreme cruelty is permitted. Dostoevsky may intend a different kind of answer, but difference is not the same as adequacy. Ivan's argument therefore remains. Free will may account for some moral evil because creatures can misuse agency. It does not by itself explain natural suffering, unequal vulnerability, or why victims bear the consequences of another person's freedom. Nor does preserving a perpetrator's choice obviously justify the cost imposed on an innocent child. Freedom is valuable, but Ivan forces us to ask whether its value can carry every burden theology places upon it. The novel complicates his moral clarity through the murder of Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov. Ivan does not kill his father. Smerdyakov performs the act. Yet Ivan has expressed the thought that moral prohibitions lose their foundation without immortality, and he leaves town while sensing danger. Smerdyakov later treats Ivan's ideas and departure as permission. Ivan becomes tormented by a responsibility that is neither direct innocence nor legal guilt. This does not refute Ivan's rebellion. A philosopher's personal failure does not answer his argument. The novel would be intellectually weaker if his illness or complicity allowed readers to dismiss the suffering he names. Instead, Dostoevsky creates two simultaneous questions. Can the world be morally accepted? And how does a person who protests its evil remain responsible within it? Ivan's nightmare conversation with the devil intensifies the division. The visitor is banal, clever, and parasitic upon Ivan's own thoughts. We need not decide whether to call the scene supernatural, hallucinatory, or both within the novel's world. Its dramatic function is clear. Ideas return stripped of the dignity they possessed in debate. The speaker hears his own reasoning mimic and accuse him. Smerdyakov is crucial because he is neither a transparent instrument nor Ivan's philosophical puppet. He has his own history of humiliation, intelligence, resentment, and calculation. By attributing the murder to Ivan's permission, he tells a truth and performs an evasion. Ideas can authorize action, but the actor still acts. Collective responsibility must not dissolve his agency into Ivan's influence. Ivan's responsibility is therefore relational and indirect. He did not command the murder, yet he sensed how his words were being heard and preferred distance to clarification. Many ordinary harms occupy this middle region. A person may not intend an outcome, but may cultivate the permissions around it. Moral maturity requires attention not only to what we mean, but to what our speech predictably allows others to do. Here, doubt is not portrayed as a simple vice. Dostoevsky's Christianity passes through doubt and does not emerge untouched. His notebooks describe faith reached through a furnace of doubt, an image consistent with the novel's refusal to give unbelief weak arguments. Still, some readers judge the positive religious voices less intellectually forceful than Ivan. That imbalance may be deliberate, or it may reveal the limits of Dostoevsky's answer. Ivan also exposes a danger in explanations of redemption. If every loss is folded into a happy totality, victims become instruments in a cosmic design. A humane faith would need to preserve protest, memory, and the irreducible wrongness of what occurred. Forgiveness cannot mean that cruelty was secretly necessary. The quiet power of Ivan's chapter lies in its refusal to let freedom solve everything. Human freedom makes deliberate cruelty possible, but invoking that freedom does not settle the victim's claim. Redemption must answer not only the guilty person's need to return, it must honor the one who was never obliged to become the setting for someone else's moral drama. Ivan also prevents compassion from becoming arithmetic. No total quantity of future happiness can simply cancel a particular person's undeserved pain. This does not settle every problem of public choice, where consequences must often be compared. It does insist that moral calculation preserve the standpoint of those asked to bear the cost. A benefit described from above may look different from beside the person who pays for it. Alyosha's presence suggests solidarity rather than explanation. He does not claim that love makes the stories acceptable. He remains with the protester and refuses the move from horror to abandonment. For some readers, this is the novel's religious center. For others, it is a humane response available without theology. In either case, companionship keeps disagreement from becoming the final severance between brothers. Ivan's protest is sometimes treated as a temporary obstacle on the way to a religious answer. Its construction resists that demotion. He does not begin with an abstract puzzle about whether evil and omnipotence are logically compatible. He gathers stories of suffering, especially the torture of children, and refuses any final harmony purchased at that price. The moral force lies in the refusal to convert a victim's experience into material for someone else's explanation. Returning the ticket differs from proving that God does not exist. Ivan imagines that reconciliation may be possible and still rejects the terms. His argument is ethical before it is metaphysical. If the final order requires that innocent suffering become necessary, he will not consent to the order. This gives protest a dignity that cannot be dissolved by calling it rebellion. The focus on children removes familiar explanations based on guilt or deserved consequence. Yet it also creates a danger if the child becomes only a symbol of innocence. Actual children have voices, relationships, and particular histories. Dostoevsky's examples are rhetorically arranged by Ivan, and the reader should remember that even protest can shape another's suffering into an argument. The difference is that Ivan uses the stories to prevent closure rather than to justify sacrifice. Alyosha does not answer with a successful theodicy. His kiss echoes the form of an answer without converting pain into a proposition. Relationship interrupts the debate, but it does not solve it. This is important because compassion can accompany a question that remains intellectually unresolved. Not every moral demand should be answered by theory. Ivan's position also presses against secular philosophies of history. A future society of justice cannot repay those destroyed on the way. Descendants may benefit, remember, and repair, but they cannot make the earlier agony necessary. Whenever politics asks present people to accept unlimited suffering for a radiant future, Ivan's refusal returns. No generation owns the right to spend another as currency. His protest nevertheless faces its own problem. If no action is permitted under conditions where innocence may suffer, political and personal life can become impossible. Refusing cosmic justification does not tell us how to choose among imperfect options. The demand for absolute non-complicity may turn into paralysis or contempt for ordinary attempts at repair. Dostoevsky allows this tension to continue into Ivan's breakdown and relation to Smerdyakov. The phrase that everything is permitted does not follow logically from Ivan's protest, but it becomes attached to the atmosphere created by his ideas. Smerdyakov interprets intellectual doubt through resentment, dependence, and opportunity. The novel does not fairly reduce Ivan to the cause of Smerdyakov's act. It asks what responsibility a thinker has for meanings that others draw from words, especially when the thinker lives ambiguously beside them. Ivan's return ticket remains one of the novel's most enduring gestures because it protects the irreducibility of the sufferer. Any faith or politics worthy of answer must pass through this refusal rather than speak around it. Dostoevsky's religious vision gains seriousness only because Ivan is not easily defeated. Part 13. The Grand Inquisitor's Gentle Prison. Ivan follows his rebellion with a poem in prose. Christ returns to Seville during the Inquisition. The people recognize him, but the Grand Inquisitor has him arrested. At night, the old cardinal enters the cell and explains why Christ's work must be corrected. Human beings, he argues, cannot bear the freedom Christ gave them. They want bread, certainty, miracle, authority, and someone to take responsibility for their choices. The Inquisitor's accusation begins with the temptations of Christ in the wilderness. In Ivan's retelling, Christ refused to compel belief through material provision, spectacle, or worldly rule. He wanted love freely given. The refusal preserved dignity, but it left humanity with anxiety. The Inquisitor claims that the Church has repaired this burden by accepting power and giving people manageable obedience. His argument is disturbing because it contains compassion. He does not present himself merely as a tyrant enjoying command. He believes the strong few will suffer by carrying knowledge while the many receive peace. He condemns Christ for asking ordinary people to live at a heroic height. Authoritarianism here speaks in the language of tenderness toward weakness. That tenderness is corrupt because it never asks the people whether they consent to the bargain. The Inquisitor defines them as incapable, then uses their managed behavior as proof. His system relieves anxiety by removing the conditions under which courage might develop. The prison becomes gentle, predictable, and self-confirming. The poem connects the politics of demons to the psychology of the underground. Both begin with the problem of independent wanting. The underground man would ruin paradise to prove he is free. The Inquisitor would prevent ruin by controlling desire. One worships refusal, the other abolishes it. Dostoevsky's implied alternative must preserve freedom while giving it a form richer than caprice. The three temptations can also be read as three shortcuts around relation. Bread alone would reduce persons to appetite, spectacle would compel belief through amazement, and worldly rule would replace consent with victory. Yet bodily need, evidence, and institutions are not themselves enemies of freedom. The danger lies in their use as complete explanations of the person and irresistible tools of allegiance. This qualification protects the poem from a false choice between hunger and dignity. A person denied food is not made freer by being told that bread is spiritually secondary. Material care can enlarge agency when it is offered as justice rather than leverage. The Inquisitor's fault is not feeding people. It is turning provision into a title of ownership over conscience. Christ answers with silence and a kiss. The gesture refuses the Inquisitor's terms. It neither defeats him in debate nor forces conversion. The old man releases the prisoner but maintains his position. Once again, love opens a possibility without controlling its result. The ending protects the freedom it defends. Yet serious objections remain. Silence can be morally eloquent, but it cannot substitute for institutions. Hungry people require bread, not only respect for spiritual liberty. A politics that celebrates freedom while tolerating preventable deprivation may offer an abstract dignity to those with no practical options. Dostoevsky's suspicion of material solutions must therefore be balanced by the dead house, where conditions clearly deform agency. The Inquisitor also speaks through Ivan, an unbelieving character who creates a compelling image of Christ. This layering prevents simple ownership. Is the poem a defense of Christ, a criticism of ecclesiastical power, an argument for rebellion, or all three? Its literary framework matters. A character stages an argument within a novel whose consequences continue beyond the staged scene. Some readers have used the Grand Inquisitor to defend liberal individualism. Others emphasize that Dostoevsky's freedom is religious and directed toward self-giving love, not toward unrestricted preference. Both notice something real. The poem opposes coercive guardianship, but it does not say that whatever a person chooses is good. Freedom has value because love without freedom would be programmed obedience. This produces the central risk. A creator who wants freely loving beings must permit refusal. Refusal can become indifference, domination, or cruelty. If the risk is removed completely, the relation changes in kind. But if the risk is permitted, Ivan's suffering child stands before celebration. Dostoevsky does not dissolve the contradiction. He places a silent figure inside it. The kiss is powerful, partly because it does not reward the Inquisitor's self-image as savior. Debate would let him remain the heroic bearer of truth. Affection addresses the person beneath the role. He is neither defeated nor excused. For one moment, the identity organized around domination receives an answer it cannot convert into policy. But the Inquisitor sends Christ away and continues his work. Love has not guaranteed repentance. This ending protects against sentimentalism. A response may reveal another possibility and still fail to change the recipient. Those who practice non-coercive love are not required to pretend that danger has ended. Boundaries and resistance may remain necessary after the kiss. The Grand Inquisitor's accusation begins from a compassionate premise. Human beings are burdened by freedom. They want bread, certainty, wonder, and a community that relieves them of the anxiety of choice. Christ, in the Inquisitor's telling, respected humanity too much by refusing the temptations that would have secured obedience. The Church has corrected this gift by building an order people can actually bear. The horror of the argument lies in its tenderness. The Inquisitor does not describe himself as a selfish tyrant. He accepts loneliness and guilt in order to make the majority happy. Domination becomes sacrifice performed by the ruler. This is one of the most durable justifications of paternalism. Those who control others claim to suffer on behalf of people too weak for truth. Bread is central because freedom detached from material need can become cruel. A starving person does not experience abstract choice in the same way as someone secure. The Inquisitor exploits a real weakness in purely spiritual accounts of liberty. Institutions that praise freedom while ignoring hunger leave the field open to authorities who exchange provision for obedience. A defensible freedom needs material and social conditions in which agency can develop. Miracle and mystery address another need. People seek visible confirmation that their commitments are not foolish. A leader who controls spectacle can turn uncertainty into loyalty. Modern forms need not be religious. Metrics, rallies, media images, technological claims, and curated certainty can create an atmosphere in which authority appears inevitable. The citizen receives relief from doubt at the cost of judgment. Authority completes the structure by taking responsibility upward. Rules become easier to follow when someone else claims final knowledge. The individual is freed from guilt because obedience replaces discernment. Yet the rulers themselves become unaccountable, since every deception is justified by the happiness it supposedly protects. The prison is gentle because inmates are trained to interpret confinement as care. Christ's silence refuses the Inquisitor's terms. A counter-argument might enter the same contest for control. The kiss addresses the person without accepting his anthropology. It neither forces repentance nor validates the system. This response can seem politically inadequate because institutions do not dissolve through personal love alone. Its force is at another level. It preserves relation without using the other's freedom as an instrument. The legend does not permit a simple celebration of unrestricted choice. Human beings do flee uncertainty, and unequal conditions make freedom fragile. The task is to create forms of authority that support agency rather than absorb it. Education, welfare, law, and expertise can reduce burdens without becoming a secret priesthood. The relevant question is whether institutions increase people's capacity to understand and participate, or merely secure compliant behavior. The gentle prison appears whenever care is defined without the cared-for person's voice. Dostoevsky's warning is not that all guidance is tyranny. It is that love becomes domination when it decides in advance that the beloved cannot be trusted with reality. Part 14. Active Love and Shared Responsibility. The positive counterweight in the Brothers Karamazov appears mainly through Elder Zosima, Alyosha, and a series of ordinary encounters. Zosima distinguishes active love from love in dreams. Dreamed love enjoys the image of sacrifice, preferably visible and quickly completed. Active love continues when the recipient is inconvenient, ungrateful, or unchanged. It is work carried out among persons who resist our preferred story. This distinction answers the underground man's performance before Liza. He enjoys the role of rescuer while the scene remains imaginary. Her real arrival makes demands on his time, pride, and conduct. He wants the emotion of love without its duration. Active love begins where the private theatre loses control of the audience. Zosima also teaches that each person is responsible for everyone and everything. Taken literally as causal blame, the claim is impossible and potentially harmful. No individual caused every crime, and victims should not be told that they share guilt for what was done to them. The statement belongs to spiritual exhortation, not criminal law or empirical description. Its more defensible meaning concerns participation. Our lives depend on networks of labor, custom, silence, attention, and neglect. We shape the moral weather around others through small permissions and refusals. A person may be legally innocent of a harm while benefiting from conditions that conceal it. Shared responsibility expands concern beyond the narrow question of whether my hand performed the deed. The idea also interrupts superiority. If I approach the wrongdoer only as a pure judge, I may ignore the capacities we share and the social arrangements that assisted the wrong. Recognizing connection does not lower standards. It changes the posture of judgment from self-exemption to accountable solidarity. We can condemn an action without imagining that evil belongs to a separate species. Dmitry Karamazov embodies the difficulty. He is wrongly convicted of his father's murder, yet he recognizes guilt for desires, threats, and the violent life he has led. Legal innocence and moral burden diverge. His willingness to accept suffering is moving, but it also raises danger. An unjust sentence does not become just because the condemned person finds meaning in it. Society still owes him truth. Grushenka's story of the onion gives active love a smaller image. A single modest kindness may become the thread by which a person is drawn from isolation. But the rescue fails when the person claims the thread as private property and pushes others away. The tale is not a rule about the afterlife. It compresses a moral insight. Even goodness can be lost when it becomes evidence of superiority. Zosima's body decays sooner than his followers expect, frustrating hopes for a confirming miracle. The episode prevents holiness from becoming spectacle. Alyosha's faith enters crisis because the community reads physical corruption as spiritual verdict. His recovery comes through memory, story, and renewed connection, not through the reversal of the fact. The sacred, if present, does not protect itself by satisfying every expectation. Alyosha practices active love less through doctrine than through availability. He listens to brothers who disagree with him, visits the humiliated, and befriends schoolboys gathered around the dying Ilyusha. His actions do not remove tragedy. The child dies. What changes is the relation among those who remember him. Shared grief becomes a promise not to forget the good that was present. Memory matters because redemption in Dostoevsky is not self-invention without a past. The person returns through a more truthful relation to what has happened. Raskolnikov must remember the victims beyond his theory. Dmitri must distinguish the crime he did not commit from the harms he did. Alyosha asks the boys to let one loving memory accompany them into futures he cannot control. Faith here operates less as proof than as practice. Zosima tells a doubting visitor that conviction may grow through active love. Philosophically, this does not demonstrate theological claims. Kind action can be practiced by believers and non-believers, and its success cannot establish a particular creed. The advice is better understood as existential. Some truths about trust and relation are known partly through participation. There is still a risk of moral overreach. Calls to humility and self-sacrifice have often been imposed on people already denied power. Active love must not require remaining in abuse or surrendering legitimate claims. A responsible application would join care with boundaries, justice, and attention to unequal burdens. Otherwise, the language of service can become another inquisitor's tool. After these qualifications, something durable remains. Redemption is not an inner feeling that one privately owns. It is a pattern of truthful action sustained with others. Freedom becomes more than refusal when it can make promises, receive correction, repair what can be repaired, and continue without a guaranteed result. Active love does not solve innocent suffering. It refuses to let suffering have the final word in the next encounter. Collective responsibility can then be translated into several practices without claiming universal blame. We can examine which harms our comfort hides, listen when our self-description is corrected, and support institutions that distribute care fairly. We can also refuse the flattering thought that good intentions exhaust our duty. Consequences and patterns matter, especially when the same groups repeatedly carry them. Forgiveness belongs here but should not be commanded. Dostoevsky often presents forgiveness as liberation from isolation, yet a victim's moral worth does not depend on granting it. Reconciliation requires safety, truth, and change, and some relationships rightly end. The freedom to return belongs to the wrongdoer as an offered path. It does not include a right to be restored to every former place. Part 15. A novel made of unfinished voices. How can we speak of Dostoevsky's philosophy when his books contain so many incompatible claims? The critic Mikhail Bakhtin offered the influential idea of polyphony, borrowing a musical term for multiple voices. In this account, Dostoevsky's major characters are not passive examples beneath a single authorial explanation. They speak as centers of consciousness whose ideas retain force even when the plot tests them. Polyphony does not mean that the author has no values or that every claim is equally true. The novels favor some gestures, images, and forms of life. Cruelty isolates, confession reopens relation, love refuses coercion. Yet these patterns do not turn Ivan, the underground man, or the Grand Inquisitor into cardboard errors. The author grants them enough freedom to challenge the vision that created them. This artistic method resembles the moral thesis. To represent another person ethically is to avoid finalizing him from outside. Dostoevsky lets a character exceed a diagnosis, social type, or ideological label. Even a ridiculous speaker may deliver an argument that survives his ridiculousness. Even a beloved spiritual teacher may leave questions unanswered. Bakhtin's interpretation has been debated. Some scholars stress the clear Christian hierarchy of Dostoevsky's world and worry that polyphony makes him sound relativistic. Others note strong authorial shaping through plot, symbolism, and the distribution of consequences. A novel cannot literally grant independence to invented persons. Their freedom is an artistic effect produced by a designing author. Even so, the effect changes how argument works. A proposition is surrounded by accent, situation, and anticipated reply. The underground man's words contain the voices he resists. Ivan creates the Inquisitor, who interprets Christ, who answers without speech. Thought becomes dialogic because no sentence is isolated from the relation in which it is uttered. Meaning includes the answer it seeks and the answer it fears. This helps distinguish polyphony from indecision. Dostoevsky can orient readers without silencing conflict. The plot may reveal the cost of an idea while leaving part of the idea standing. Raskolnikov's crime defeats his claim to personal exemption, but the novel does not prove that history contains no tragic collision of duties. Ivan's crisis exposes complicity without making innocent suffering intelligible. The disagreement is useful because both sides correct an excess. If we hear only hierarchy, the novels become disguised, sermons and their strongest objections become traps with predetermined answers. If we hear only free voices, we miss the moral and religious orientation that recurs across works and journalism. Dostoevsky's art lives in the pressure between design and dialogue. That pressure also explains why he should not be called a systematic philosopher. He does not define terms consistently, build premises in orderly sequence, or settle counterexamples. His novels stage thought under conditions that philosophy sometimes abstracts away. Fatigue, money, erotic jealousy, social humiliation, bodily illness, family history, and the need to speak before someone. This is not a superiority claim. Conceptual argument can reveal ambiguity that fiction leaves hidden. Ivan's rebellion requires philosophical analysis precisely because emotional force does not settle validity. Fiction contributes a different knowledge. It shows how a belief changes the believer and how an argument sounds when another person's life becomes its test. The method guards against a common misuse of Dostoevsky, lifting one sentence from a character and presenting it as the author's final wisdom. The line may be ironic, strategically spoken, revised later, or contradicted by the speaker's conduct. Reliable interpretation follows voices across scenes and compares fiction with letters, notebooks, and journalism while preserving differences among those forms. Polyphony also helps explain why the novels remain open after conversion scenes. A person is not finalized by one confession, one crime, or one moment of grace. Raskolnikov's future still requires living. Alyosha's faith still encounters Ivan. The Inquisitor remains unconvinced after the kiss. Freedom persists on both sides of redemption. The reader is included in this structure. We must judge without receiving a complete authorial map. One reader may find Ivan unanswered. Another may experience active love as the deeper reply. A third may reject the theology while keeping the moral psychology. The book does not make these readings equal in evidence, but it does make interpretation an act of responsibility rather than extraction. Translation adds another layer of voice. English readers encounter names, rhythms, biblical echoes, social registers, and repeated terms through particular translators. Variations such as demons, devils, or the possessed can emphasize different aspects of the same Russian title. No brief documentary can settle those choices. Awareness of them encourages modesty whenever a large interpretation rests on one English phrase. The novel's crowded conversations also make rereading unusually productive. A claim that seemed final may later sound defensive. A comic interruption may carry the moral fact. This delayed revision imitates conscience. We often understand a conversation only after its immediate purpose has passed. Dostoevsky builds that afterlife into form, allowing an earlier voice to change without replacing its words. Dostoevsky's polyphony does not mean that every character is equally correct or that the author has no convictions. It means that important voices are allowed enough independence to resist becoming examples in a single explanatory lecture. Ivan's protest is not cancelled by Alyosha's faith. The underground man's insight is not erased by his cruelty. Raskolnikov's theory is refuted in action, yet his struggle exceeds the moral label assigned to it. This unfinished quality is produced through form. Conversations break into confession, interruption, mockery, rumor, and sudden reversal. Narrators admit uncertainty. Information arrives through interested witnesses. A character may speak more powerfully than the plot's apparent judgment of him. The reader must evaluate voices without receiving a final neutral transcript. Mikhail Bakhtin's influential account of Dostoevsky and polyphony emphasizes this relative independence of consciousnesses. The concept has generated debate, since novels remain composed artifacts and Dostoevsky clearly arranges outcomes. Still, polyphony names a real experience of reading him. Characters appear to discover possibilities in speech that are not reducible to a thesis announced beforehand. The form carries an ethic. To encounter another consciousness is to meet a perspective that cannot be completely finalized from outside. Labels may be necessary, but they never exhaust a person. The criminal is more than the crime, the believer more than belief, and the skeptic more than an obstacle to faith. This does not forbid judgment. It forbids treating judgment as total possession. Unfinalizability is especially important in confession. A final account of oneself can become another prison. The underground man announces every defect and still remains hidden behind the announcement. Raskolnikov's legal confession does not complete his moral transformation. Change continues because the meaning of an act develops through future relation and response. A person is answerable for the past without being metaphysically identical to the worst description of it. Polyphony also explains why Dostoevsky can be appropriated by opposed readers. Religious, existentialist, conservative, socialist, psychological, and literary interpretations find genuine material because the novel's stage conflicts rather than flatten them. This richness does not make every appropriation faithful. Historical context and textual detail still set limits. The reader's task resembles participation in a difficult conversation. One must listen long enough for each claim to gain its strongest form, notice the emotional and social conditions of speech, and judge without pretending to stand outside every voice. The result is slower than extracting a quotation. It is also closer to the moral world Dostoevsky creates. An unfinished voice is not a voice without consequence. Smerdyakov, Stavrogin, Ivan, and Raskolnikov affect others through what they say and withhold. Openness must remain joined to responsibility. Polyphony keeps judgment in motion, testing it against the continued reality of persons who answer back. Part 16. Objections at the edge of the circle. Dostoevsky's world is large, but it has edges. His emphasis on spiritual freedom can undervalue material reforms that expand real agency. Food, housing, education, health, and legal protection are not shallow substitutes for meaning. They shape whether a person has time and safety to choose. The underground man's attack on rational planning does not justify indifference to preventable need. His treatment of suffering creates a second objection. Again and again, pain precedes moral awakening. This narrative pattern can suggest that humiliation is spiritually necessary. Some religious interpretations defend exactly that conclusion. Yet Dostoevsky's own scenes also undermine it. The penal system often brutalizes. Nastasia is not healed by injury. Children in Ivan's rebellion cannot be compensated by harmony. The most careful synthesis is that suffering may become the occasion for transformation, never its sufficient cause or moral warrant. A third objection concerns religion. Dostoevsky's Christian response is embodied more persuasively than it is proven. A kiss, faithful presence, and active love may answer hatred at the level of relation, but they do not logically establish God, immortality, or providence. Readers can affirm the practices while withholding the metaphysics. Believers may reply that the novels deliberately refuse coercive proof because faith must remain free. That reply explains the form, though it will not persuade everyone. His political thought invites a harder judgment. The critic of revolutionary domination sometimes idealized Russian spiritual destiny and supported positions entangled with empire. In a writer's diary, he voiced anti-Semitic stereotypes and hostile collective generalizations. These fail the standard of irreducible personhood that his finest fiction teaches. Historical context can explain their availability. It cannot make them harmless. There are also questions of gender. Women such as Sonia, Nastasia, Grushenka, Katerina, and Liza possess memorable agency, but their suffering often carries male moral development. Self-sacrificing love can become feminized labor while philosophical rebellion is granted to men. The novels complicate this pattern, yet do not escape it. A modern reading should listen for the consciousness. The narrative does not fully unfold. The dramatic method itself can distort. Dostoevsky concentrates coincidence, extremity, and crisis. His characters speak with an intensity rare in ordinary conversation. This can clarify hidden motives, but it may also make stable kindness seem less real than breakdown. Most responsibility is practiced without fever or scandal, arriving on time, sharing credit, keeping confidence, revising a decision. Active love needs these untheatrical forms. Psychological admiration creates another hazard. Dostoevsky did not invent modern psychology or predict neuroscience. His characters are literary constructions shaped by 19th century debates, religious symbols, and narrative needs. They can illuminate shame, rumination, divided motives, and moral injury without serving as clinical evidence. Modern mental health language should not be projected backward as if it completed the novels. Even the defense of freedom can overstate conscious choice. Human agency is conditioned by development, trauma, disability, social power, and processes outside awareness. Responsibility comes in degrees and must attend to capacity. Dostoevsky sometimes resists explanation because he fears it will become excuse. But understanding causes can support prevention, compassion, and more accurate judgment without erasing agency. After these objections, his central achievement remains. He makes reduction feel morally dangerous. A person is influenced but not exhausted by an environment, described but not completed by a diagnosis, judged but not identical to a verdict. This remainder supports hope. Yet it also demands caution because the person can still surprise us toward harm. His modern relevance lies less in particular policy than in this double vigilance. We should distrust systems that treat people as predictable units and distrust romantic celebrations of whatever resists the system. Freedom needs material conditions, truthful limits, equal dignity, and practices of repair. Without conditions, it is thin. Without limits, it becomes domination. Without repair, it remains proud isolation. Part 17. The Freedom to Return. We began with a familiar and unsettling fact. A person may know the better road and turn away from it. Dostoevsky gives this refusal many rooms: the underground apartment, Raskolnikov's garret, the conspiratorial meeting, the Inquisitor's cell, and the crowded Karamazov household. In each, freedom appears first as an opening that no formula can close. That opening makes deliberate cruelty possible because another person can be treated as material for a private project. The underground man uses Liza to repair wounded pride. Raskolnikov makes lives conditional on an idea. Rogozhin confuses love with possession. Pyotr Verkovensky converts companions into instruments. The Inquisitor imagines a whole population as children who must never be asked. Their actions differ greatly in scale and guilt. What connects them is not a single diagnosis. It is the attempt to escape mutuality. Another person's freedom brings uncertainty. She may refuse gratitude. He may contradict the theory. They may not become the community imagined for them. Cruelty forces the reply and calls the silence peace. Yet the same openness allows confession. Raskolnikov can speak a truth that pride concealed. Dmitri can recognize moral debts beyond the crime falsely assigned to him. Ivan can refuse comforting explanations and still discover that ideas have consequences within relationships. None of these movements is guaranteed. That is why they remain actions rather than programmed corrections. Dostoevsky's most persuasive vision of redemption is modest. It is not pain becoming good, a court becoming infallible, or a theory defeating every objection. It is the return from self-enclosure to answerable relation. Someone tells the truth without controlling the response. Someone stays without approving the harm. Someone remembers the injured person as more than a step in the offender's renewal. What remains doubtful is the larger theology. Ivan's protest is not cancelled. The freedom of a wrongdoer does not compensate a victim, and future harmony cannot make cruelty necessary. Active love offers a way to live after the unanswered question. It does not close the question itself. This may be why Dostoevsky needed novels and competing voices. A system seeks a final arrangement. His deepest subject is the person who remains unfinished within every arrangement. The unfinished person can betray, repent, refuse forgiveness, renew trust, or repeat the wound. Hope and danger occupy the same space. In ordinary life, that space is usually quiet. It appears when an explanation becomes an excuse, when a judgment becomes an identity, or when help becomes control. It appears in the pause before a defensive reply, where several futures remain possible. No dramatic conversion is required to notice it. Freedom alone is not salvation. It needs a good toward which it can move, and Dostoevsky names that good as a demanding love among persons who cannot be possessed. Whether we share his faith or not, the moral shape is recognizable. Love must leave room for an answer, and responsibility must remain after the answer disappoints us. The open sky above Semyonovsky Square did not turn Dostoevsky into a simple witness with one message. He carried its light into prisons, scandals, arguments, and doubts. Near the end, his work still leaves us among voices, none fully silent and none fully secure. Perhaps redemption begins there, not when the last argument wins, but when a door once used to keep the world outside is left unlatched and morning enters without being commanded.